And I'm hitting record. Hi, my name is Lissa. I am your instructor in Intercultural Comm. I am super excited about teaching this class this semester, but it is a tricky class in the sense that we're going to have some real conversations about stuff that in the rest of society can get really kind of dicey as far as making people uncomfortable. White privilege and white fragility can often be triggered. And so I just want to make sure that we all start on a good space and we have some honest conversations about our own experiences and our own perspectives. And that'll set the groundwork, the ground rules, sort of norms and expectations for us as we go through the semester when we're giving each other feedback so that we can try to do it in an effective way. And what's beautiful about this is that that's what makes this sort of a lab class, in the sense that you want to learn about intercultural communication, we're literally going to practice it within this class. So when we practice how we navigate these conversations with one another, we will be learning how we're going to navigate it with other people out in the future, coworkers or people we want to do things, or when you're applying for things and you're advocating for yourself. All of those things, if you have an understanding of intercultural communication, you should be more effective. So hopefully this is good for society, good for the world, but also good for each of you individually. If you wouldn't mind, Erin, if you're available, could you show your video so that we can see you too? I usually like to have all my students have their videos live in Comm classes, just because we all know that like nonverbal communication is so real. Again, knowing that this is an asynchronous class and you are not required to have a real-time meeting, I just feel like it will be a great way for us to set some foundations. I think that's it. Erin, are you there? Maybe you stepped away for a second right when we first got started. Oh, I see that you said one moment. No worries. Sounds good. In the meantime, I'm going to share screen again, and now I'm going to share with you the exercise that we're going to do today. And let me see, I've got it pulled up over here. That was the doodle poll. There it is. Okay, this is pretty tiny font. Let me make it a little bigger. So this is the exercise. Before we get into this, and hopefully maybe one more person will join us, we'll go through and we'll just do quick introductions, our names, why we're taking this class, and anything you think that would be, useful or interesting to share about yourself. And then once we do that, we'll jump right into the exercise. I only want to take 30 minutes. I know your time is precious, and I know that this is not, a real-time class, so I'm not going to abuse that. But just so you're thinking about it, we're just going to respond to 4 different prompts. The first one is a movie or a book that was about a culture that's different from your own. And then you guys, since there's 4 of us total, we'll actually pair up into 2s and 2s, and I'll participate. You're going to tell the other person about a time when you had watched a movie or a book that depicted somebody who was different than you, and how do you know if it was accurate or not, right? So we're going to talk about representations and whether or not we feel like they truly represent us and why, or represent a group that's different than us. Then we're going to talk about a positive intercultural communication experience we've had, something significant that made a big difference. And then you're going to share with your partner, and we'll switch, right? Whoever was with each other for the first question, we'll switch to another person. And we're going to tell the other person about it. What made it so positive? What were the conditions that made for that positive interaction? Then we're going to talk a little bit about negative interactions. Again, we're going to analyze a little bit like what made it negative and what were the conditions that made it negative. And you can see how this is going to be connected to the expectations and norms in this class, because we're going to try to create the space for positive interactions. And, if at all possible, try to diminish some of those negative interactions. And that doesn't mean we're not going to disagree, right? Negative is not the same as, having a different opinion. It's more like, did you walk away feeling unheard or hurt or misunderstood? That is more of an example of a negative. And then we'll end with, when did you become aware that you were part of an ethnic or racial group, right? And we'll talk about that, because there'll probably be some differences across all of our experiences. So that's the exercise, and I've got some debrief ideas here, and don't worry about that. I'll bring those up as we get through and we deal with those questions. But that's the plan for today. Does everyone sort of get it? Do you have any questions before we get started? Okay, let's jump into introductions. So good to see you. Anyone want to go first? I'm seeing that's a no. What's going on
Hey,
behind you? Oh, that's so
I'll
funny.
go first, I guess.
Cool. Sounds good.
Hey, I'm Keaton. I'm going for a degree in communications right now. I'm almost done, so hopefully next year. For this course, I'm sort of just taking it as a placemaker. Um, I sort of want to dive into communication more because I would like to go into a sports role down the line for a job. So I think communication's big, like especially if I like would want to do something like maybe like a reporter or something, because you have to
Very cool.
communicate with different like cultures and different races.
Yeah.
Especially with media, I feel like.
For
So
sure. No, yeah, I'm super excited to have you in this class. I did a little stint as a freelance journalist. I worked for Source New Mexico and then also was over at UNM in their student, program at the Daily Lobo there. And you're absolutely right. Like sports is really in some ways it's the fun thing in the news, it's not necessarily like as serious as news can be, or even business, that has like all these other sort of dry implications, but important for society as far as, our economy and things like that. But what has been explained to me and I really appreciate is the idea that sports can make the important interesting and the interesting important. So, right, sports can be an opportunity to talk about race, can be an opportunity to talk about gender, can be an opportunity to talk about, historical exploitation. Like there's so many ways to have this avenue that gets people who are there because they want to have a good time and they're interested and they're fans. And then you can have really big, important conversations because you started with this interesting hook. And then on the other side, sometimes like I was just saying, like the economics or whatever, important stuff can be really boring. You can make important stuff interesting through sports, right? When you're talking about differences in race, now all of a sudden it's like, oh, this isn't just like eating my broccoli. This is actually kind of interesting and fun to learn about and maybe grow from. So I think you have a really important role, and I'm really glad you're in this class. And I also hope you have a lot of fun with sports. I hope it's not always deep and serious and big deal stuff. Okay. I haven't introduced myself yet, so I'm happy to do that. And then maybe Tina, you can go, and hopefully Bryn will come right back on. Okay. So my introduction, I already gave a little introduction in the discussion board, but just sort of more building off of that. I'm a part-time instructor here at CNM. I've been teaching since 2011, so I have a few years under my belt at this point. I am also a PhD candidate over at the University of New Mexico in the communication program. So Keaton, if you're thinking about transferring there, talk to me because I've been there a long time and I know a lot of folks. And like I said, Daily Lobo is an amazing, opportunity. So that might be cool for you. This is my dog, Louie. He's getting older in years, but he likes to be right next to me. So he's a sweetie and he likes it when I teach classes because he knows I'm not going to move for a while. So he can just sort of like squeeze in there. Interculturally, I would say, my personal experience is that I grew up in California. I moved down to Los Angeles. I lived in Sacramento for a while. I also did a stint as a research sort of fellowship in Chicago. And I ended up marrying a man who's Armenian. And we're no longer together, but we had a daughter who's now about your age. She's 19 years old. And so his Armenian identity was really, like where I first started to learn deeply about how race is socially constructed. When he would go into certain environments, he would be treated as if he was brown or black. He was teased in school. And then other environments, he'd be treated as if he was white and privileged. And so his race literally shifted based on the context, even though his skin color never did, right? And he's sort of like literally like melatonin in your skin. He's like olive skin colored, like right after 9/11, he would be pulled out of, whenever we'd go through an airport. If I went with him, he would pass. If I didn't go with him, he was always pulled out, and they always went through all of his, luggage and stuff like that, because there was a lot of like anti-Muslim fervor. And though, if you don't know your history, Armenian was actually a Christian nation well before any Northern European countries were Christian nations. But a lot of people don't know that. They assume, if you look Middle Eastern, you eat hummus, you have Middle Eastern cultural practices, you must be Middle Eastern, and that by definition means you're Muslim. So I learned a lot about race there, and I actually took some really cool intercultural communication classes starting back in 2005 from the author of the text that we're using in this class. So she's a mentor of mine. Her name is Catherine. I touch base with her pretty regularly, talked to her just a couple weeks ago actually about this class, and am excited to have her mentorship as we go through this. There are a number of other ways that I've been really engaged in intercultural communication. It's important to me, but I really appreciate having the opportunity to work with you all. And, I think that I continue to grow as a white woman. When we get to the section where we talk about when did you first, notice what your race was, or were you aware that you had a race? I will likely be at the oldest age of, most people in this class, because white folks that have privilege, which we all do, we oftentimes, especially if we're in insulated sort of environments, are unaware of our race because it is the dominant race, and it sort of has been presented to us in many representations as the norm. And so it's hard for us to sort of raise that awareness because we are rarely discriminated against as young people. And so it takes a while before no one sits us down and is like, hey, let's have the talk about what it's like with, a police officer comes up to talk to you. That just doesn't happen. So we'll get there. But it's a pleasure to meet you both. And like I said, I'm super excited, hoping that Bryn or Erin joins us again. But in the meantime, Tina, would you mind introducing yourself?
Okay, my name's Tina. I'm actually a teacher, so that's part of why I'm taking this class because I'm only a substitute right now. I'll be getting my kind of my own classroom next year and teaching art, but a lot of students here in New Mexico are indigenous, black, and immigrants from other countries. I've even met kids that are from like Guatemala, El Salvador, like places in South America that they like really did come across the border and like swam across the Rio Grande and stuff like that. And like I knew that I was kind of like aware of cultural sensitivities and stuff like that, but we have a couple teachers at our school where every single kid accuses them of like microaggressions, being racist, just having like making weird comments and stuff like that. And I really want to avoid that as much as possible because as a teacher, like one wrong comment can make a child so uncomfortable that they cannot learn in your class. And so I really want my kids to be able to learn and feel comfortable around me and stuff like that. And like just be aware of certain cultural norms. So that way, like even in conversation, I already know what they're talking about. And I don't have to be like, oh, is that a black thing? You know what I mean? Cause that's just like, it's just weird, you know? So I'm trying to just diversify myself. And this is a requirement for an educational license, but like I'm not mad about that, obviously, because I think it's really important to just be more aware of things. Like if all of your friends are people of color and you're not learning about race as a social construct, literally, what are we doing? Like, that would just be weird. So, yeah.
100%. Yeah. I was just thinking about that situation that you were just talking about this morning, of my own childhood, and how, my family, my dad had very serious mental illness, and my parents divorced when I was really little. And I was that little kid that was that sensitive, right? Like as soon as I felt like I was misunderstood or judged, I went into like flight or fight disassociation mode and literally could not learn for, like I had to almost have days to kind of come out of that state to be back into a state where I could like actually focus. So I think it's amazing that you are sensitive to that. And, we're going to talk in this class about how when mistakes happen and you make mistakes, how to handle that and how to grow from it and be humble without letting it absolutely derail you to a point that you can't function. Right? Because that's not helpful either. I did just get a text. It looks like Oh, Anthony got called into work this morning, so he's not going to be able to join us. So that's too bad, but I'm glad that he gave us the update. So I'm super bummed that Aaron hasn't come back, but that's okay. We're going to start off with the two of you, if you guys don't mind. I'm going to put you into a group and I'm going to post into the chat that first question. And I'll pull it up again just so that you guys can read it if you want. Okay, so you're going to think of a movie or a book that was about a culture that is different from your own. Tell the other person about it, but also consider if the depiction was accurate, right? How do you know if it was accurate? So that's going to be the first one. Like I said, I will just copy and paste that into the actual chat. Hopefully I can do that. And then there it is. Okay, here comes that. I might need to pop it in again too after you get it put into groups because sometimes you can't see the chat. So we'll figure that out. And then I'm reminding myself how to put people into groups. It's been a second since I've used, oh, there it is, breakout rooms. Here we go. Okay. Here, let's go. See you in a second. I'll give you like a minute to talk about this, maybe 2 minutes.
That it's
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure
it-
the chat when you're in here, or do I need to re-enter it?
no,
Yeah,
I
you can see it.
yeah,
Okay,
you can
cool.
see it.
Okay, then I'm out. Bye. Okay, welcome back. Okay, so we'll debrief, obviously just between the two of us, or the three of us. I did get an email, by the way, from Erin, and she's driving and she went out of service, so it
That's what I
dropped.
was gonna say probably happened.
So she's trying to get back on, but she's struggling with her reception. Okay, so what movies or books did you guys choose?
Oh, we didn't get to finish.
Okay, too funny.
I chose a show. It's called Evil. It's about three people who assess whether or not things are supernatural for the Catholic Church. And one of the main characters is like an ex-Muslim, and so it kind of goes through his journey of like you know, he sees his mom during an experiment where they're supposedly seeing God and stuff like that. And like his family, like his sister and stuff like that, she's a hijabi woman, and so she's very passionate about him like coming back to Allah and stuff like that, and it almost makes her feel like he's almost left the family in a way because they are all practicing Islam, and so it makes her feel like she's kind of like alienated from him, but then obviously he has his own reasons and stuff like that. So it kind of like shows him just processing and going through that like little journey with himself and religion and stuff like that, because he's a science man. So kind of his reasoning was because he has to see it to believe it. And so throughout this show, he's actually seeing things are supernatural and questioning like where his place is and stuff like that. And so that was really, I don't know how accurate it is, but there was no like caricatures or anything like that. So it was definitely like really interesting.
That's cool. And then Keaton, which one were you thinking of?
For me, I sort of the Pursuit of Happiness. I feel that like
Remind me of what that one's about. Is that the one with Will Smith?
yes, yeah, Will
Yeah.
Smith and his
Okay,
son.
cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
I feel like you sort of like see that in everyday life. I mean, it's just not with his race, but with races across the whole country. I mean, people are trying to get on their feet and like they're
Yeah.
struggling.
So now
I
let's
thought,
talk about accuracy? Like, have you talked to any Black folks in specifically about whether or not they felt that that representation was true to their experience or not?
For me, no, not really. Not
Fair.
yet.
Yeah.
Um,
It's, yeah, legit.
There's a couple people on TikTok who have broken down that movie and kind of explained it from like a Black person's point of view to white people, trying to explain like why this happens to a lot of people and stuff like that. So I know that there's a few people at least who do think that it's accurate.
It has some accuracies for sure. I know that because again, my dad had such severe mental illness and he was homeless for part of his life, that I resonated with that movie as well in some
Mhm.
ways. I went to Glide Memorial, the church that sort of like did that. Was the space where it's been a long time since I've seen that movie, but if I remember correctly, Will Smith goes to a specific church and they like help him out,
Mhm.
and then he's able to get back on his feet. But I do think that there's some, interesting systemic aspects that movie actually does accurately reflect, in the sense that we don't have a lot of safety nets in our country with regard to public resources. So we do end up relying on faith-based organizations and like philanthropic donations in order to provide support specifically with folks who are unhoused. And I think that can be a cultural thing as well. I dated a guy for a long time who was unhoused sort of by choice. Once he got used to living outside, he wasn't comfortable paying rent, and he just felt like it was such a waste of resources. And um and the assumption that anyone who's outside would want to live inside and have a 9 to 5 job, and have to deal with all of that, I thought was, sort of enlightening for sure. I was trying to think of a movie or something that I had watched that I wanted to, talk about maybe the misrepresentation aspect. And I was thinking of,
I've
do you
seen a lot of that.
I know, right? Like there's so much
Yeah.
simplification.
Mhm.
In one hand, I remember the first time I ever watched Bridgerton. Again, my own white privilege sort of like being shocked that they were representing these English, aristocrats in multi-diverse, skin tones and different
Mhm.
cultures. And it was just like, whoa, and that's a Shonda Rhimes, produced show. So
Yeah.
obviously, like maybe, I don't know about historical accuracy, because it's like romance novels. Like there's really, there's some aspects of it that are, historical, but it's not intended to be technically accurate. But it is fascinating to learn that there are some connections, like Charlotte maybe,
Yeah.
had some African sort of ancestry. But it also, the fact that I was noticeably, like I noticed immediately the depiction, I thought really spoke to how much all the media I've consumed in 50 years almost of my life has not been diverse, right?
I
That I,
thought,
you
oh,
know, go
I
ahead.
thought Bridgerton was really interesting because at first, the first thing I thought was this isn't realistic, but then it reminded me of how so many people who were formerly enslaved were had a document that said that they were legally white because, maybe like their former owner died and left them an inheritance and freed them or something like that. So it is kind of interesting that maybe that really was happening around that time. You know what I mean? Maybe there was more like Black people in society because of situations like that where they were just seen as, well, they're a different or they're the good one. You know what I mean?
Or
Yeah.
yeah, and like, why is it that we trip up on that aspect of accuracy, but the other ones that are inaccurate, we're like, oh yeah, suspend belief because this is make believe. Like some things
I don't
create
know.
cognitive
Yes.
dissonance and some things don't. Obviously,
Mhm.
systemic racism.
Yep.
So, okay. So, does it reproduce any stereotypes? So, with regard to Pursuit of Happiness, Keaton, do you feel like there were any stereotypes that were represented and reproduced in that movie?
I think so. I think with racism, definitely.
Yeah.
Um, and then I feel that people have to like the one scene that sort of got in my head was like how when his buddy wanted to take him to the football game and he sort of had to like lie his way out of saying like, oh yeah, like I have this and this. And
Mm,
he just didn't. And then he was just like, I don't know. I feel like that is like that could be hard to like tell people because even there's sometimes for me, like with like going out, because my job's all right. I mean, I'm just trying to like pay rent and do stuff for myself. And then
Sure.
there's some people who are like, they're like, oh, do you want to like go out and do stuff? And I'm like, well, I sort of gotta like pay other bills. So I sort of have to
Yeah.
like decline sometimes. And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, what happens to me like too,
Well,
but like
classism plays a role, right? People, you know, are going to judge you historically in our society if you are not, you know, of a certain socioeconomic status. And
Mhm.
so we feel that pressure. That's the concept from chapter 1 about hegemony, where we participate in our own oppression. We discipline ourselves, we course correct ourselves, because even though you're not necessarily trying to perpetuate classism, you feel that you're going to be disciplined, or you might lose out on access to friendships or connections or just space saving, you know, if you admit to your own poverty. And so I really can relate to that. I think the question though is like, what stereotypes were almost like overly simplistically represented in that movie? And for me, it's again that white savior, right? Stereotype of like the white church comes in and saves the day. And even though that maybe was one example where that actually did happen for one person, making it a movie sort of like has this power of saying, oh, this happens all the time, right? Like this is, and the only way to really help a black man get, you know, back on their feet is for white people to come in and save the day, right? And so that's the reinforced stereotype that I think is hard to like see initially, but as you start to see those patterns, and I think if you've lived it, you really recognize it. So for me, I was thinking about, I don't know if you remember, if you ever saw the very original like Disney movie, animated movie about Belle, Beauty and the Beast, right? And because I have experience with the culture and sort of the differences of mental health, I remember when her father saw, you know, the beast, and therefore was the townspeople, you know, thought he was crazy. He was seeing delusions. And so they came out, you know, in pitchforks and stuff, and they like put him in a paddy wagon and they carted him off and they incarcerate him because he was seeing these delusions. And I really related to that as somebody whose dad did see actual, like had delusions and had, you know, like different thoughts in his head. And I remember thinking, wow, what a stereotype that it's okay for society to come out and be so threatened because this guy said he saw something, that we would totally, to children, right? Like that was like that movie came out and kids watched it, of course. I mean, it's a Disney movie, right? And we are telling kids, oh, and in this situation, it's totally okay to come and take somebody against their will and put them behind bars because he saw, you know, somebody, he believed he saw something that no one else believed he saw. And I'm like, that's such a fascinating message. And talk about reinforcing at a cultural level a stereotype, because people are very, very afraid of people who have serious mental illness, right? Statistically, people with schizophrenia are less likely to engage in crimes than, say, you know, people are more likely to be murdered by a spouse in their own homes than by anyone. I mean, like 97% of all, you know, violent crimes happen like that, but people are afraid of people who have mental illness. So I felt like I could relate to the idea that even though I love that movie, and I don't want to make all of you like every time you watch a show now be like, oh, what about the other message that's going on here? But I have to say that if you're a communication scholar, that does end up happening. It's
You
really,
already break down videos
yeah.
and movies all the time. Yeah.
It's totally true. And it also, I mean, there's some power in knowledge. So I think that there can actually be some peace that you can find when you stop, you know, just consuming what's being presented to you as if it's at face value, just this easy thing to consume. Okay, let's jump in. I know it's 10:34 and I wanted to keep this quick. The next one is think of a positive intercultural experience, something significant. And I want you to tell each other about it and talk about what made it positive and what were the conditions that make for positive intercultural interactions, right? So I'll trust you to know from your own experience. It has to be something that wasn't just like, oh, I went to the store and, you know, the guy behind the counter was wearing, you know, a turban and he was really polite. Like try to make it an actual interaction that was a little bit more meaningful and significant. Okay, I'll drop the question again in the chat and I'll go ahead and put you guys in groups. Cool. See you in a couple minutes. You're back. Okay, good. Did you guys have enough time that time? I know I didn't post the question until like the last second.
Yeah, we did.
Okay, good. Okay. What are the experiences that you shared?
So I talked about how when I lived in a homeless shelter when I was younger, we like bonded with one of the families there, a black family, and they let me and my brother join them for hair day, which is basically where they spend an entire day taking down their braids, washing their hair, and then doing a new protective style. And how it was just like a very like intimate, like family bonding session almost between the mother and her two kids. And how it was like a time to be vulnerable and stuff like that, where I felt like it was always really risky to be vulnerable for them because of the, like aggressive black person trope and stuff like that. It was a really good time for them to like have a family chat and stuff like that. And they also were really open to me. And we were talking about how like the innocence of childhood, I feel like made it a very once in a lifetime opportunity because as an adult, I probably wouldn't have had an experience like that. And so because I was a kid, they were more open and like willing to answer my questions and stuff like that without seeing me as like a threat or something, to like risk their safety.
Yeah, no, that sounds one super cool that you had that opportunity.
Yeah.
And, like not to silver lining in any way homelessness, but it's funny how vulnerability can create opportunities,
Yeah.
and when you said that, it reminded me of my own like childhood experience where there was a family that lived next to us, and the two kids, Marina and Junior, like took me into their family, and they like took me
Yeah.
with them, and I got to go and have like tamarindo, and we went to the
Oh,
like
yum.
swap meets and stuff. And I just, until you said that, I was like, oh yeah, I'm so grateful that they were so generous and so kind and didn't, I could have just stayed at home watching TV all by myself all day when my dad was at work, but
Yeah.
instead, yeah, that was really cool. And then what about you, Keaton? What was the positive experience that you remember that was intercultural?
I think for me, it was with a coworker. It was like like me and him just like, he just asked for me to like go over to like watch a game or whatever. I forget what it was, but um, like the rest of his family was there and I didn't really realize that. And she's like Hispanic.
Mm,
And so for me, I feel like especially with New Mexico, you sort of see like I don't know, a lot of race and Hispanics, or
mm.
like not race, well, I guess like different intercultural like guides with Hispanics.
Are you saying that there's like a lot of mixed race within
Mixed race,
Hispanic
yeah.
families? Okay, gotcha.
Right. Yeah. Sorry. And then they sort of just like brought me on his family because I didn't realize it. It sort of like threw me off guard in a way at first.
Mhm.
'Cause I thought it was just gonna be like me and like my coworker. And then we sort of like throughout the like game or whatever, throughout the afternoon, they sort of like got into like a lot of like good communication with me and like just asked about like where I'm from. And for me, like I'm adopted, I'm from Russia. So I sort of just like opened up and I've like told that my whole life, I feel like. And
Mhm.
then down the line, like when I was younger, I sort of like didn't really want to open up because I sort of got judged by classmates like
Sure.
earlier. And so like now that I'm older, I feel like it's just like open up, like just go for it because nothing's gonna hurt you. Um, and then they were just like really like positive and supportive, and they still are like to this day.
Oh, that's cool that you continue to be friends and connections, or do you know them still?
Yeah, I still know them. Yeah. I hang out with them every couple weeks.
Oh, that's great. Yeah,
Yeah.
it sounds like the way that you guys were both describing it is, you felt that when somebody was trusting and vulnerable and inclusive, that helped you to feel like you could be safe too, and maybe be more open and inquisitive and learning and respectful. So those are some key expectations that I think might be really good as we go into our own interactions in this class, right? To try to emulate that sense of wonder and openness, and also, on the other side, to hope that the other side give them the good faith, expectation that maybe they will be kind and supportive and not judgy, but understanding and warm and inclusive and welcoming. It helped that you like got both of you got invited kind of into somebody's intimate space, like whether it was their home or an activity. So I think that sometimes context really matters, right? And unfortunately, the online space is notoriously not a safe space for communication, right? There's this anonymity and people do horrible things and say things as if they're not going to be held accountable for them. So I think we should try to remember that. Part of why, like, I wanted to invite you all to here today is to create a little bit more of a more intimate, safer space where we can, at least in real time, communicate. And hopefully all the students that get to watch this later will also feel that warmth of, this is not meant to be a, you know, a judgmental space. It's not meant to be you know, an aggressive space. I was trying to think, for me, like, I felt, again, similarly to you two, that when I was invited into my ex-husband's family, I remember thinking, wow, through my eyes, I see you all as so brown and so different in race from me, from the way I was raised. Like, my grandparents said really racist stuff about Armenians and in their neighborhood and stuff like that. And they were like, we don't see ourselves as that different as a race from you, right? Like, we see ourselves as white. And so that was a big eye opener for me, to be like, aren't you in solidarity with all brown people? And they're like, no, we have racism within our own culture. And we identify as white most of the time. And, you know, knowing that they had experienced discrimination, but also that there was maybe some benefits to identifying as white, especially in their generations, that if they didn't identify as white, they would experience even more discrimination. And my friends here in New Mexico have expressed the same thing, like that their mother's generation would be beat if they spoke Spanish in school, and that, you know, identifying as Hispanic instead of Latino, or Hispanic instead of mestizo, or anything like that, was a more beneficial, easier way to get through life. So understanding that there's, you know, those that can be positive as having no negative consequences, and honoring the history of those negative consequences, I think could help. So now I'm keeping an eye on the clock and I don't want to keep you for too long. So let's just talk amongst ourselves without you guys going into the breakout group about a negative intercultural interaction and what went into that, as a way to sort of think, as this is a model of what we want to avoid in this class. But do either of you off the top of your head have
Is
an
it
example?
something that we were like personally involved in, or is it kind of be something that we kind of like witnessed?
I mean, I think you can be impacted by something you witness. Like, I'm imagining the people who watched, like, the George Floyd incident were not technically personally involved, but forever changed by that interaction,
Yeah.
right?
So,
Yeah,
oh, sorry.
go ahead.
So for me, one that really sticks out to me is, this was right after I had educated myself on kind of like the colorism and racism in South America, and how because they were more heavily colonized by like the French and the Spanish, there was like 30 different races depending on who your mom and dad were and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And so it created so much more like colorism and just hatred for indigenous people. So I had a coworker at my job who, she was a Calderon, so she was a Hispanic person, but she was like a white Hispanic person. And she was a bartender slash server. And we had a native family come in, and immediately she was like, don't sit them with me. And I was like, you know, wasn't really getting it. So I was like, why? And she was like, well, because they're Navajo. And Navajo people, they always come in here and they're poor and they don't even leave a tip and they don't have enough money to come here and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, that's a really bold assumption. Like, you don't know these people. Like, you know what I mean? It's a Sunday, it's brunch, things are really cheap right now. This restaurant is a cheap place to come, so I don't really understand like why we're even getting mad about that. But it was just interesting because before that, I had assumed that because she was Hispanic and she understood what it was like to be racially discriminated against, that she would feel more in solidarity with other people of color. And so to watch her turn around and just absolutely crap on an entire tribe of people, when in New Mexico, the Navajo people are one of the highest like population, you know what I mean? So it was super weird to me, and that was my first time like seeing like colorism or just, you know, racism coming from somebody who wasn't technically like white. I that was my first time seeing that, and it was very interesting to like learn and stuff like that. So that really opened my eyes to the fact that like racism does kind of happen in every single country, and like, yeah.
That kind of gets at the last question of today too, right? Those of us that were raised white have these assumptions about racism not being
Mhm.
across all cultures. But there's so many levels of what you said. I think I want to synthesize it down though to assumptions.
Yeah.
One aspect of what made that a negative interaction, right? And I think that you, to your point, that there was some negativity on multiple levels, negativity from your coworker to the people who came in, negativity between you and your coworker, where you had to sort of
Mhm.
like reevaluate, maybe this is somebody you respected and liked, and now you have to decide, now what is my role in this? Am I supposed to intervene? Am I supposed to ignore this? Right? Like that creates some tension, and there's some power. Did they predate you? Did they have more power in the environment? You know, that kind of thing. Is it your place as a white woman to tell a Hispanic person that they're being racist?
Yes. Oh my
Right?
gosh.
So
Yes.
lots
Yeah.
of like levels of again,
100%.
history and assumptions. Keaton, what are your thoughts on either that interaction or maybe one that you experienced?
I think one that I experienced was with my aunt and her two boys. Because my aunt's white, she adopted two African American boys, from Kansas, yeah. And I went to go visit her. My family did a couple years ago, and we went to go to like a restaurant, I believe, for maybe like breakfast or lunch, like same in your situation, Tina. And then I believe the server was just acting a little shady, towards like, because they were younger, I think like 4 or 5 at the time, and so you clearly see like kids at these age, they sort of just act out,
Yeah.
restaurants. And she was sort of just like being like very like a cold shoulder to us at our table, and it's like the rest of us are like white, my family is, and so I sort of was sort of just like, I felt awkward in that position, and I felt it wasn't right for the server to be like that. So I remember that like my I'm pretty sure like my mom just like got really upset, and she was just like, I'm not gonna deal with this. And
Mm,
so she sort of just we paid and everything, but she was just like, that wasn't really cool. And then my aunt was just really distraught. And in my defense, I was like, it wasn't their fault. I mean, they acted out in a way, but I'm like, they're just kids, like, and just because you see them as color, I mean, you sort of just like, I felt like she sort of just like, what's a good word for that? Like,
She like well, that's like a microaggression. She assumed that they have
assumed,
behavioral
yeah.
problems because of their skin color
Hmm.
instead of just because they're 5.
Yeah.
And I think
So,
what I'm hearing you say, Keaton, too, is that tension that you felt, right? You were watching people in your family where you learn how to navigate these situations. And you're like, what is my role in this? Am I supposed to let it slide? Are we supposed to leave and not pay? Are we supposed to stand up for it? Does it make it worse or better? Right. And that there's so many paths. I'm hoping that what we can take from that, like to this class, is if we can create a space where you can speak up and allow that to not cause a huge furor of or emotional response where people can maybe say, okay, we're going to allow people to say things that we disagree with, or to, call us out gently, call us in, call us out, but still we'll expect that that's going to happen. And maybe if we have a plan for how we'll handle that, if that happens, right? Like, are we going to immediately respond or maybe take some time? Create, get rid of some of that power imbalance of the server versus it's kind of a stranger, right? Like it's not a family member that you can just talk to usually very frankly. They kind of have control and power in the sense that they could destroy your food or make it gross in some way, right? You've been taught to be polite to them because they are serving you, which is like a gracious thing to be gracious for. Even if you're paying them, we're still gracious that somebody would do something kind for us, like make us food, right? So there's so many elements there. But I'm hoping that maybe the takeaways, we have to trust that if we do get called out, that we can respond in a way that's maybe listening as much as defending, right? Like that we hear it. Because what would you have liked that server to have done? What, if you had said, hey, I think you're wrong in your assumption about these kids, or that's not really a fair assumption, what would have been the ideal response from that server?
probably defending herself in a way, but I feel like it could have been like fake, like, oh, like, no, I wasn't doing anything like that, you know?
Oh yeah, that's likely what she would have done, but what would you have wanted her to do? What would have been, from your perspective, the best way she could have possibly handled that?
I think for me, probably like, I don't know. I guess just to like have a better attitude.
Yeah,
Uh,
right? To say, oh my
yeah.
gosh, first maybe apologize and be
Yeah.
like, you know what? You're right. I'm sorry. And then maybe having enough sense to know why you all were there and thinking about how could she like make a gesture at least to show that she like heard you. So she could be like, you know what, I'm gonna, I don't know, comp your meal or take part of your meal, and not have to pay for it. So there's like this, I understand what you want. I've done wrong by you. So I'm now gonna make an effort to like show you I care enough to try to make it right, and then not like stop functioning, not be like, oh, I'm gonna go into tears, or now this is about me, or now I have to like have this
Mhm.
whole meltdown, right? It's like, I'm gonna hear you, I'm gonna apologize, I'm gonna try to show you I'm genuine in my apology, not just the words. And then I'm gonna continue to function. I'm gonna continue to do my job and go through the next one and not be like eating myself up all day about, wow, I'm such a horrible person. That wasn't my identity. And now they hate me. Like, let it go.
I feel like that is so important for white people to be able to understand, like to just not pull like a poor me when somebody is telling you you are being racist or you are being insensitive, like I don't like what you just said, like that kind of stuff. I'm really learning how to not have that like white fragility where I feel like I'm being attacked or something like that, and like
Right.
just like chill out, hear what they're saying, and move forward without making yourself the victim. It's, yeah, it's definitely a learning process because I feel like culturally, for at least for me, like white people and my kind of like family and up in like in Connecticut and stuff like that, super common to
Mm.
immediately feel like you're being attacked and targeted, and like now you have to make the situation all about yourself and blah blah blah, and I like, yeah, I don't like that.
No, that's fair. And to the point that I made earlier, that I was one of those kids that like a little bit of a bad experience could send me into a
You're
whole
shut down.
tailspin, where I
Yeah.
shut down. I struggle a lot with fragility and defensiveness.
Mhm.
I put a lot of heart into like these classes. And when I have students who will give me feedback sometimes, especially across the power differential between us, that's a really tricky thing for me to do. So I have to have a rule that says I'm not going to respond for 24 hours. I maybe am going to touch base with somebody I know who can maybe see this, like interaction with a little bit more perspective, whether that's a colleague of mine or if it's an interaction about race, right? Somebody who I can trust that I can talk to about racial interactions and give me some insights. So that's sort of my plan. And then also ask for some grace, right? When we're in this class, knowing that people may get defensive and they may react a little emotionally, trying not to hold that against them for the rest of the class, trusting that we're in a moment. We all have had bad moments where we aren't thinking, and there's some beauty in that kind of authenticity in a way, especially in an environment where so many things are controlled and mediated. It's nice to have somebody be real with you every once in a while. But just I think we need to agree as a class to know that the people who you disagree with the most are probably the ones that you're going to have to work the hardest to practice how to be patient with,
Yeah.
and how to be supportive of. So, okay, I feel pretty good about that conversation. The last question is, when did you become aware of you're being part of a racial, ethnic, or cultural group? And tell the other person about this, or tell each other about this. So let's go ahead and just answer that question quickly, and then we will be done. Um, let's start with you, Keaton, this time, if that's okay.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I think that I was aware of a group was with like, I'm trying like my job, I feel like, or
Well, I think the question is like, when did you realize you were white?
oh,
What age?
yeah, I think for me it was probably like late or like maybe like fourth grade, I'd say.
Okay.
Um, yeah, I mean, I sort of got like the most like openness, I guess, from like my parents and like my family. Because for me, like I sort of like I don't know, because I feel like my skin is sort of like a little brown in a way, but it's not like completely. I mean, like my arms, and then I think it's just like the culture stuff that I was doing. Like I was just like eating like normal foods that everyone does, and then just like like doing stuff like that. I mean, I don't know. I feel like I have a lot of like just like aspects that like a lot of white people do. Sort of.
Sure, I
So,
think I know what you're talking about. A couple
yeah.
One, your use of the word of normal for food made me sort of cock my head because again, we normalize, right, certain cultural foods as if normal is white, right? So just
Mhm,
trying to raise our awareness a little bit about that. And just for me, when I saw you in this class, couldn't necessarily identify your race, right?
mhm,
For me, especially in New Mexico, knowing so many Hispanic folks who have light skin, but that they, have all sorts of different like racial backgrounds, melatonin amounts in their own family, but also the way that they were raised, they don't identify as white because that's, they've experienced so much oppression and they identify as definitely not being in the dominant culture that I wasn't entirely sure of your race. So you were able to pass for me in some ways. You have darker hair, right? And, the lighting's not perfect and all that other good stuff. But
yeah.
we will talk about maybe, I hope in this class, I think it's in the 3rd chapter, where how race is so constructed, like what is white, what is brown, sometimes somebody who has lighter skin, somebody with a tan, a white person with a tan can be darker skinned than somebody who is, very light skinned but is black, or Indian. So there's so many things about like race being a construct that I think are really relevant to this. But I hear you said about 4th grade thinking about foods and realizing that yours was the dominant group, right? Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
I think mine was definitely school too. I certainly didn't realize I was white before I went to school. Um, I think that I had a really good best friend in 1st grade who was Japanese. And that probably was the first time that I realized that there were different cultures and that there were different races. Um, And I remember I had an accident at her house where a dog bit me, and her mom was so petrified that like my family would hate her, and it was like excessively like worried. And I'm like, my dad was a veterinarian, even though he was very mentally ill. And we like expected that. I mean, I'd been taught as a kid that it was my responsibility if I got bit by an animal. So I was so shocked that she felt so bad. And I felt bad for her because I think she was much more aware of the racial difference than I was, and was scared, was genuinely scared, because, a white girl had been in her care and she'd gotten hurt. And I was like, I just love you guys and I love my friends, but I had little power in that dynamic. So I think around 1st grade is probably when I was aware. What about you, Tina?
So I always knew that like my skin color was different, you know what I mean? I grew up, and I was talking about this before. I grew up in like the darkest part of Florida because the more impoverished you are, the more segregated it is in terms of like blackness and stuff like that. So, like I went to an all black school, and I never saw myself as like a different person or anything like that. But I'm also autistic, so it took me like somebody actually telling me like that you are different, you know what I mean? So like even in high school, we brought kids over from Mexico to go to school with us, and I knew that we have different like race and culture and stuff like that. But unfortunately for me, it didn't really click until what happened with George Floyd and everything in 2020, where I realized just being a white female presenting person, I have so much more privilege than other people. You know what I mean? Like even my landlord, so I just bought this trailer and it is a mobile home and it's not really livable, but I talked her down from 6,000 to 2,000 because it's not a very good place. And like the first thing that happened when I moved in is she started crap talking everybody in this neighborhood about how, oh, everybody here is like illegal or undocumented, or they bring their whole family in and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, that is normal to me. That's not weird for them to find a place that's cheap to live that takes undocumented people and doesn't do a background check. Like she was almost judging people for taking advantage of what she has to offer. But
Yeah.
she didn't judge me for that. And so it was super weird. Like I just didn't understand because I'm like, you're the one who doesn't do a background check. You're the one who doesn't take a deposit. So why are you mad that people who don't have rights in our country are taking advantage of what you're offering them? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I've just seen a lot more of that recently, of me getting opportunities that I feel like I wouldn't normally get if I wasn't a young white female. You know what I mean? Because people see me and they're like, I want to help you. I want to give you opportunities. I want to help you advance your future, like blah, blah, blah. Whereas, you know, even a boy, they would see, even if it was a white man, they would say like, oh, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like, you need to work for this. This is your job. Like, blah, blah, blah. So like on one side, I'm seen as like this helpless, like person who needs help. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
that was like super weird to me because I'm usually seen as the poor foster kid who's a delinquent and like should be in jail and all this stuff. So it was super weird for me. But as soon as I turned 18 and I started like struggling, people didn't see me as like a criminal or something like that just for being poor. And now they see me as like, oh, you're like a damsel in distress and like you just need help and stuff like that. It was weird.
Yeah.
And like I'm so fortunate. I'm so fortunate. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of insights in that. I'm glad you shared that. I think there's a tremendous amount of power and privilege,
Mhm.
even in the lack of privilege of being female, right? Like it's
Yeah.
a whole load of crap to have people assume that you are not, that you're less powerful and that you
Mhm.
need to be protected. At the same time, there's also power in that, right? Because
Yeah.
you can be protected, you can be, given opportunities. And the other point I think that you really highlighted there is that intercultural communication is not just about interacting literally in the moment with somebody of a different culture. It's also about
Yeah.
those moments when you are interacting with somebody in your own culture who looks to you and is like, you're an insider. I can share
Yeah.
with you. You and
Mhm.
we're going to be on the same page of this. And you're like, now what do I
Or
do?
not though.
Right? Right. And they don't
Yeah.
see that. They assume that
They
you are.
yeah, people see white skin and freckles and they are so comfortable just revealing everything about themselves to you. It's
Right.
kind of scary a little bit.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I hope this is useful for everyone who watches it. I really appreciate the two of you showing up. I know it's really hard for us to all find a time. And make sure you start practicing now already, and trying to work with, your peers, because I know at the end of the semester, you guys do have a group assignment and you have to figure out a way to all meet together. I know it's going to be tricky because it's been tricky for this particular just get together, but I know you can do it. It's the assignment. You'll figure it out. And thank you for being in this class. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens next. This next chapter is a pretty dense chapter. It's about globalization, or actually this week's chapter is about globalization, which has some really advanced concepts. So super encourage you to read it a couple times, send me questions if you have questions, ask questions in the discussion board if you want to, get some insights from any of the folks in class that maybe have more, international experience would be really relevant, but globalization affects all of us, right? So great to hear from you. Thanks for making time. I'll talk to you guys later and have a great
Bye.
day.
Have a
Bye-bye.
good one. Bye.